Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Zoom. Our guest this evening is Mr. Kusum Vijay-Tilaka, no stranger to our program, of course. And we thought we'd ask him what his take is on Sri Lanka. The crisis continues. Very good evening to you, Kusum, and welcome to the show.
Good evening for us. How's things with you?
We're very good, but it's very worrying because the crisis in Sri Lanka, of course, continues. It started off with an economic crisis, or people called it a dollar crisis. It moved on to an economic crisis, into a political crisis, a social crisis, the birth of the Aragalaya. It then went on to all sorts of other crises, fuel, gas, interest rate, pensions.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think there's anything of any substance that hasn't been engulfed in a crisis. We have children fainting in schools. We have people who are reduced to one meal a day, and so on and so forth. So, Kusum, what is this government doing? We have a president who was appointed by 134 members of supporters of the SLPP, and he came in and he told a reporter from overseas that he's here Churchill-like because of a crisis, and that his job was to resolve the crisis. But quite frankly, it is about 7 or 8 months since he's been, and I don't see the end of the crisis.
Well, for us, I think you mentioned a plethora of crises there. I view all the Sri Lankan crises as emanating from a singular crisis, and that is the crisis of governance. And when you look at some of the decisions that were made by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration at the outset, some of the people that were put into these positions where there were key decision makers who were not qualified for those positions. There were people that were pretty much just members of that cabal. So the governance crisis is what led to the policy making that's now led us to where we are right now. And I think the problem that most Sri Lankans view is that it's been quite some time since this new government came in. It's been several months. There have been reforms, but there seems to be a trend where the reforms seem to be for us, not for the government. So the government hasn't seemed to. If you take, for example, electricity charges up again. I think it's 66%, the most recent increase. So that brings the total increase maybe up to 200%, depending on your block. So, but what are the reforms that the CEB has undergone? Have we seen any sort of rationalization of staff costs, of overtime costs? It's these kinds of things that it seems like the burden just seems to be completely moved towards the people, away from the state and towards the people. Now, it's understandable that the state is broke. The Sri Lankan state has no money, has very little foreign reserves, has nowhere to move. So they've taken the burden and put it on the people, as if the people have any more room to maneuver than the government. Most people were already struggling after the pandemic, after the Easter attacks. And all we've seen since the new government came in has been, well, there's been reform, and no one will doubt that there is an urgent need to reform a lot of these things. But I think it would be far more palatable and far more acceptable to the people if we saw some governance reform as well, where you're showing the people that, okay, the government is also trying to change itself, trying to align itself with best practices. What we see with the current government is generally people who are from the UNP hierarchy. They're on national television very regularly. They make all sorts of statements. They're not elected. Most of them, all of them, to a man, didn't win an election in the last time of asking. So we see just a different set of people being put into these places of authority, and now they're lecturing the Sri Lankan people on the need for reform. The Sri Lankan people have taken most of it thus far. I think, even though there's been island-wide protests in various forms in various places, by and large, I think the people have taken up the reforms as best as they can. For how much longer it remains to be seen, unless we see some real progress in terms of governance reform. I don't see the people taking this for much longer.
But, quite frankly, now we've been told, originally we were told that the IMF loan or the bailout, if you like, would be coming in sometime at the end of December. They were very confident of that. I suppose they had to be, even if it was only for political reasons, but they were confident. That didn't work out. Now they're saying that it's at the end of March. End of March is a few weeks away. There seems to be a singular lack of cohesion, a plan on how Sri Lanka is going to address its debt. We are at the moment, we don't service our international debt, and tourist numbers are slowly rising, of course. But people, especially in Colombo, are sort of complacent, or they're happy even. They say, well, things are different. And what's different? They say there's no fuel queues, but actually we have fuel rationing. We are down to 20 liters a week. The tourism industry is impacted by that because not all tourists want to spend an hour and a half at a bank to load up a card, which they then can get fuel without to the value of those euro or dollars or whatever it is. And so there's that complacency. But the government seems to be more interested in maintaining or hanging on to power than anything else. We don't see any of these ministers saying, look, we're cutting down by ABC and, we're not doing this or we're not doing that. But yet the people are being asked to forever and a day. I mean, when you look at the electricity rises, the latest ones announced, and you look at it in the lower people who consume up to, say, 60 units, the increase can be, I saw a report, 261%. And overall, I think 66%. But people say, well, look, we'll pay, but what's happening to our money? In all of this, what is the international community doing? What's India doing? They are big brother neighbor, if you like, and they've bailed us out with, I think, up to $4 billion thus far. There's a limit to what they can do, but what are they doing?
Well, for us, just first on the IMF issue, I think there was a very interesting piece in the Sunday morning newspaper this last Sunday with Dr. Nishan Demel. I think he's the executive director of Beauty Research. I think you've had him on your show. He noted that it seems just from the language that's being used in the press and in the media releases by the finance ministry, he noted that it seems that this Sri Lankan government is overly dependent on the IMF to give us a roadmap for reform. Now, he mentioned that, well, the IMF will be able to do that, but are they the best people to tell Sri Lanka how to reform? It seems that the government sort of taken a back seat in drawing up this plan, which is why some of these reforms are so unpalatable. So he seems to suggest that maybe the government hasn't done its best to negotiate with the IMF. So this is something that I think some of the opposition parties have also been mentioning more recently. On India, I think, our friends across the pond have been quite fantastic to Sri Lanka. I don't think there's any doubt about that, especially the visit of Subramaniam Jaishankar, the Ministry of External Affairs of India. His visit gave us a lot of hope. The letter that they gave regarding the restructuring process that they sent to the IMF was I think, very welcome. It had a lot of interesting and important facts in it. And China itself, since we mentioned China, it's one of our largest creditors. Their letter was also provided, but it seems the international community, the IMF, the United States weren't quite as pleased with the Chinese letter. Now, as you mentioned, we've been expecting this IMF facility, $2.4 billion for the best part of 6 months, 9 months for us. Now, there's a few things to note here. The quantum of the IMF facility isn't huge. $2.5 billion is not a lot in the grand scheme of things. But of course, the point is that IMF approval opens doors to other financing, other multilateral institutions, maybe the World Bank, maybe ADB, maybe bilaterals. They will all have more confidence in the Sri Lankan economy. So it's not just about the $2.3 billion. But having said that, I think we have to accept that the IMF's stance on this $2.3 billion is interesting because $2.3 billion is not a hell of a lot of money in the modern financial context for us. I think there are banks globally that will disburse loans of $2 to $3 billion on a daily basis. So $2 billion is not a lot of money. And say we get $2 billion from the IMF tomorrow, say the other countries lend to us on whatever basis, provide soft loans, etc. Then what is the plan? And I think this is what a lot of economists have been pointing to. They're asking, okay, are we just waiting for more borrowing? And once we get more borrowings in foreign currency, what are we going to do then? Are we going back into the same process where we fund our reserves, we peg the dollar a little bit lower, and we just hope for tourism to pick back up? There's every possibility that we'll be here having a similar conversation in 2024 if we go with that route. So I think some of the policy making now, I would have hoped by now, we can look beyond the IMF facility and see what our plans are to develop more diversified inflows of foreign currency, building an industrial policy, finding ways to rationalize our spending, looking for new supplies for energy. There's all sorts of things that we could be doing and having discussions about right now. Instead, what we see is the government just trying their best to make sure there's no huge mass protests. And you mentioned the fuel queues. Now, I think it's clear that the queues in and around Colombo have dissipated. That's true. But that doesn't mean that the people aren't struggling. It just means that people know that there's no point queuing because they're not going to get anything from queuing, right? So there is obviously there's a lot of emphasis on the situation in Colombo. And I think the situation in Colombo is being managed quite well by the powers that be. It's when you shift away from Colombo, when you go to the rural areas of Sri Lanka, when you see what the farmers are saying about the harvest, when you see what the unions are saying about the cost of living, I think just because there are no queues, and just because you don't walk outside your door and see people queuing up for gas and fuel, that doesn't mean that there's any higher sense of stability. I think, if anything, 6 months down the line, people are feeling even more insecure than they were before. I mean, the interest rates are still at 25, 26%. Inflation is still at 50, 60%. Food inflation is even higher. How are people surviving? And now we've just had a 66% increase in electricity rates. So I think something's got to give for us. I don't think this sort of arbitrary stability that we're talking about can last for long. And we said this, I think a lot of people were saying this in March, April last year. Even when the protests were becoming more severe, people were saying, well, this is, you haven't seen anything yet, this is going to get worse. And I have a feeling that no matter how many policemen they deploy, no matter how many military people they deploy, once the people of Sri Lanka truly come out in force, I don't think there's going to be enough security forces to contain this thing.
True, but in between all this sort of, what we can really see is political chicanery, really, and nothing else. Surely, the need of the hour is to address our economy and our economic problems. And in between all this, of course, we have India, apparently India, asking for the full implementation of the 13th Amendment. Surely, I don't know whether the people in the former conflict areas and in the north and the northeast, whether they want the 13th Amendment fully implemented, or whether they want to see a ready availability of food and grocery items and so on and so forth, and to see the millions and millions of dollars invested in, let's say, in the leisure industry, actually bearing fruit, rather than thousands of empty rooms and very, very few staff.
Yes, Faraz, I think that's a very interesting point you brought up, because the fact is that Sri Lanka is dependent on a number of things. We're dependent on energy imports, we're dependent on tourism, we're dependent on the international community. So in a sense, our domestic policy is somewhat determined by our foreign policy. And we've seen that throughout. I think you'll know more than me about the 70s and the 80s and how there was a certain imposition by India in the 80s through the Indo-Lanka Accord and 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, it's perfectly rational for people to discuss the devolution of power. I think it's something that is a progressive thing to happen, the devolution of power to the provinces. But I think we have to separate a Sri Lankan project of power devolution, and we have to separate that project from the 13th Amendment and the Indo-Lanka Accord. The Indo-Lanka Accord, regardless of what anyone's personal feelings are about it, there's a very good reason to believe that that the Indo-Lanka Accord was signed under duress, that it was a certain imposition by the Indian government on Sri Lanka. We remember the tensions of the time. You remember how even during the signing of the Indo-Lanka Accord, I believe many members of the Jaya Jayawardena cabinet didn't attend the function. We remember Rajiv Gandhi's visit, how he was attacked by a military cadet while he was inspecting the guard. So the tensions from the 1980s have never really gone away for us. And we've sort of left it in the back burner for so long that you can't blame India. India has to certainly balance its own domestic politics. And part of the domestic policy dynamic for India is the Tamil Nadu government and the pressures that the people of Tamil Nadu place on that government to try to force a reconciliation and devolution package in Sri Lanka. I don't think we should be surprised that India are looking at the 13th Amendment, but I think it's down to the Sri Lankan leadership to stand firm and say that we've made commitments, we've not kept those commitments, but it's all about having the ability to tell the Indians and the international community at large that we will make a good faith effort to solve these problems internally. I think this might be unpopular with some of your viewers, but I do think the 30th Amendment and the Indo-Lanka Accord, it sort of poisoned the conversation around devolution of power. Devolution of power is a principle of government. There's nothing wrong with the devolution of power. It's a fact that many people see it as an imposition from India. That's the problem that we have to get over, because if anyone looks at the evidence, it's quite clear that there was a certain amount of duress placed on the Sri Lankan government to sign the Indo-Lanka Accord. I think the Indo-Lanka Accord itself seems straightforward, but there were also letters of exchange and an annexure included in the Indo-Lanka Accord, which talked about Indian interests on the island. It talked about the Trincomalee harbor and the Trincomalee oil tanks, and how India should have the right to develop it. Now, I don't think these things should be related to any devolution of power. Those are two very different things. If India or any other country wants to develop the Trincomalee port, that should, or the Trincomalee oil tanks, that has to be a completely different conversation. So these are not simple conversations to have. These are very complicated things. But the problem is that we are on the back foot, and we sort of have to take whatever is given. That's at least the perception. I think you'll find that if the government goes in that direction, a government that doesn't really have a popular mandate, if they try to force this 13th Amendment on the Sri Lankan people, it's going to just be a reversion back to more violence and more upheaval, especially in the south, where people will, just like in the north, they want some sort of economic relief, and they'll see a lack of economic relief as well as the 30th Amendment, which they've always been against. So I think we have to understand both sides of that story.
And on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a peek at this evening's headline news from the Newsfirst primetime news team. And we'll see you on the other side of this of the break.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali. Student activists stormed into the Education Ministry, demanding the reopening of the Buddhist and Pali University. IUSF's Vasantha Mudalige arrested again for storming into the Education Ministry. Election Commission has not legally called for an election, and there are no funds to conduct an election, President tells Parliament. Local government election was called for with the consent of all members and was done legally, says Chairman of the Election Commission. Petition against the local government election postponed to the 11th of May. Opposition protests in Parliament calling for an election. Harsha overlooked. Mayantha appointed as chairman of the Committee on Public Finance.
Experience Experience the best in healthcare at Dardens Hospital. We continue to evolve into a purpose-built hospital built to deliver world-class care. Trusting us for all your healthcare needs. Dardens Hospital, dedicated to you.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
Welcome back to Newsline Zoom. I'm in conversation with Mr. Kusum Wijayatilaka, and we are discussing Sri Lanka's crisis continues. Is there hope round the corner, Kusum Wijayatilaka?
Well, for us, I think the hope is with the IMF, apparently, correct? So, as usual, we are completely dependent on external parties. So we are waiting for this money. And the point is that once we get the money, as we discussed, what happens next, right? So I think if we keep going on this current route and the government keeps going along with this reform program without really going in for a people's mandate, we're going to be back on pretty shaky territory, because if people feel that these reforms are simply a way for the political elite to pass a burden on to the people, they're not going to take these reforms very well. You have to make the reforms, one, palatable, but also show very clearly that they're in the national interest, and that the national interest is not the interest of whatever government is in place. The national interest is the national interest. It's for the people of the country, and tell them that there is some goalpost somewhere that we're trying to reach, that this is not just an endless list of reforms, and that hopefully things will come out the other side. There has to be a plan where you can tell the people what's going to happen.
What it appears to me that what is singularly lacking is a sense of equity, that the optics are all wrong. The people are being constantly asked for more taxes, tighten your belt, and tighten your belt. But when I'm on the roads in Colombo, we see all these politicians traveling around in gas-guzzling vehicles. It's as though nothing has changed for them, but it has changed for the people. So when we see international organizations talking about economic crimes and so on, as the United Nations did, and I think I saw a clip, somebody from the IMF saying that the government of the day must have a legitimacy. They said you must have the mandate to be able to carry out these reforms and so on. The reforms that are obviously needed. But, in between all this, we saw, we had reports of a U.S. aircraft, a large one, a C-17, that landed in Sri Lanka sort of mid last week. And whatever for. We're wondering what on earth is going on. Something is happening. Now they're saying that, well, we don't need China's agreement. We'll carry on with this IMF. So what is that something? Is it that they're going to sell, going to implement the 13th Amendment, for example, in exchange for some pretty pronto help? What's going on? What's your reading? What's your analysis, Kusum?
It's hard to say for us. I think, look, there will be a certain contingent of Sri Lankans that would be very happy to exchange the 13th Amendment, full implementation of the 13th Amendment in exchange for any sort of financial aid, financial help. But I think this sort of digs us into a hole further down the road, because whenever you have the next election, the next national election, you will find the ultranationalist forces emboldened, will you not? They will come out and say, well, this is the first step towards separatism. This is the first shot fired in the war that we initially claimed victory for. So I think in that sense, we have to look at the 13th Amendment internally. Like I said, I don't think there's any point in expecting the 13th Amendment to solve our foreign policy issues. The foreign policy issues are not going to go away. If anything, if we satisfy the international community, we then have to face a large group of people in Sri Lanka that will be completely against the 13th Amendment and its implementation. So it just gets rid of one issue and creates another issue. So I don't think this is the point in time to be considering the 13th Amendment. But I think at some point, some government with a popular mandate has to take a look at any instrument that can devolve power away from the center, at least to some degree, because I think it's quite obvious that the power that is concentrated in the center has not served Sri Lanka very well. I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If that was the case, Mahinda Rajapaksa could have done it at the end of at the start of his second term, having won the war. And Gotabaya Rajapaksa could have done it with his 2/3 majority.
In fact, Mahinda Rajapaksa committed to it. He committed to it very forcefully. Absolutely. He said we were going to go beyond 13th Amendment. So
unfortunately, history shows that Mahinda Rajapaksa has been rather economical with the truth from time to time, even before he became the president, in his undertakings to the JVP, only to get their vote to come in and then drop them like a ton of hot bricks. But that's another story for another program. Perhaps Shamir Rasuddin wants to do that one. But, yesterday, President Biden was in the Ukraine. He said, Kiev stands, Ukraine stands, democracy stands. Well, in Sri Lanka, Colombo stands, Kandy stands, Jaffna stands, Mathura stands, everywhere else stands. I dare say Medamulin is standing as well. And, democracy is standing. But the fact is that in Sri Lanka, and this point has sort of bypassed, it's gone, one flew over the cuckoo's nest style over our politicians. Sri Lanka has a crisis. Some of our people don't have enough to eat. We have children fainting in schools. We have a power rationing system. Whatever you say and do, there are from time to time power cuts. We are limited to 20 liters of fuel. So I suppose if you have 5 cars, you're all right, because you can have 100 liters of fuel a week. But you don't find people out in the village having 5 cars, do they? They've got their 20 liters. And what can they do? Where are they going to spend it? The cost of fertilizer is like over 200,000 rupees now. So where is the plan for recovery? We have the SJB taking issue with the JVP NPP, about some policies which they said was, the JVP said that, look, that was a policy back in the 80s. And that is 40 years ago. It's now not the same thing. It appears to be that the opposition, the collective opposition, are insecure in the face of a pretty strong SLPP with 134. So where's the plan? What do you think will happen? Do you think Aragalaya 2.0 or whatever it is will start again?
Well, for us, I think we have to hope that there won't be an Aragalaya 2.0, because just from the sheer fact that there's going to be so many people that are hurt, people, the violence is going to escalate. And we know that Ranil Wickremesinghe the president has already shown his teeth with this. He's not going to take any mass protest lightly. He's going to bring in the troops. And that's going to be devastating for the people. I think we've seen so much violence in our country over the past that we really shouldn't hope for any more protests. But it's not about whether we think or don't think it will happen. The fact of the matter is the current trajectory is going to lead to that. I mean, there's nowhere else there's no belts left to tighten. There's no other way.
But what will elections do?
Well, I think the point is that we're trying to get some trust in between the government and the people. Okay, so the fact of the matter is that whatever trust that there was with the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government and administration, it's completely gone. Right? Now, everyone is aware. I don't think anyone believes that the UNP is in charge of Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe might be in charge to a certain extent, but we also know that the Pohotua is very powerful in parliament, and we know that Mahinda Rajapaksa, they're still pulling some strings. Intrinsically, people know this. I think they understand this. They see that the levers are being pulled. They understand that the UNP is trying to buy some time for its own electoral purposes and for the SLPP's electoral purposes. And at the same time, you mentioned that the opposition parties are sort of taking aim at each other. This is always, I suppose, part of the risk when you go into these things, because the Sri Lankan opposition, the various factions, whether it's the SJB, the NPP, the SLNC, all of these parties, they haven't come to any sort of collective, have they? So they are sort of in their own silos, and they're attacking each other from those silos. This is politics. I don't think there's any way to get around that. But the fact of the matter is that the clear and present danger to the country has to be the lack of governance. And governance can only improve if there's a perception that the people in power are trustworthy and that you have had some say in putting those people in power. Right now, we don't have either of those. The people at the top of the hierarchy are not trusted, and then they weren't even elected by the people. So I think it's quite clear that at some point there has to be a renewal of the mandate, without which I don't see how we can actually attack the economic problem at its root. We can fix the symptoms. We can say we've rationed the fuel and now there's no queues, but the actual disease isn't being studied, isn't being looked at. And the disease is our lack of foreign currency earnings. The disease is our lack of industrialization. No one's talking about that.
Kusum Wijayatilaka, thank you very much for being on Newsline Zoom. However depressing the news was, what are we to do, as they say in Sri Lanka, what to do? There is a lot to do. The government of the day can start by having a resounding plan for economic recovery, not merely to try and tax their way out. That's the way it was, ladies and gentlemen, on Newsline Zoom tonight. Take care. Have a great evening as much as you can. And as always, God bless you all.
But don't forget, we were a government under the guidance of His Excellency President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who finished the 30-year-old war.
No, that's totally wrong.
We know
that's
the
totally
truth
wrong.
is
where the youngsters has a possibility to come forward and engage in policy making.
Mandate of the government and the mandate of the president is tested.
By voting, we add our voice to the chorus that forms opinion.
Wait,